He thought the plea deal would bring relief. 4 life sentences, no death penalty, a future even if it was behind bars. But for Bryan Kohberger, trading execution for existence hasn't brought peace. It's brought something far more insidious. Silence. Not the silence of meditation or reflection. The silence that presses against your skull. The silence that echoes louder than screams. The silence that hour by hour, day by day, slowly dismantles everything that makes you human. Inside the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, time doesn't pass. It accumulates. Each second adds weight to the last until the hours feel like stones stacked upon your chest, crushing you into something smaller, quieter, less alive. This isn't just prison. This is purgatory with a mailing address. Welcome to J Block. Welcome to one of America's 15 worst prisons. Welcome to the place where Bryan Kohberger will spend every remaining day of his life, surrounded by concrete, razor wire, and the ghosts of 4 young lives he stole in the darkness of a November morning. But this isn't a story about what he did. That nightmare has already been told. This is about what's being done to him, and whether what he faces behind these walls is justice or something else entirely. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to witness isn't just another true crime story. It's an unflinching look at what happens when punishment becomes perpetual, when isolation becomes infinite, and when a man slowly discovers that some prisons exist inside the mind, not the walls. Tonight, we go inside Bryan Kohberger's prison life, hour by hour, day by day, a life that some call justice, others call torture, and most never think about at all. July 23, 2025, Ada County Courthouse, Boise, Idaho. The judge's voice cuts through the courtroom with the weight of finality. 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for burglary. The words hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Bryan Kohberger sits motionless. His face, that face that has been analyzed frame by frame, pixel by millions, reveals nothing. No tears, no relief, no visible emotion at all. Just that piercing stare his own attorneys once described in court filings, a stare that sees everything and reveals nothing. The families of his victims fill the courtroom. Their grief is palpable. Their loss, incomprehensible. Christy Goncalves, mother of 21-year-old Kaylee, stands and addresses him directly. Her words are a curse wrapped in a prayer. May you continue to live your life in misery. You are officially the property of the state of Idaho. The gavel falls. Within hours, he's processed, fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of the civilian clothes he wore to court. Given a number, 163214. No longer Bryan Christopher Kohberger, 30, former PhD student. Now just another piece of inventory in Idaho's correctional system. The drive from Boise to Kuna is short, just over 10 miles, 25 minutes in traffic. But for Kohberger, strapped in the back of a Department of Corrections transport vehicle, it might as well be the river Styx. No one speaks. The only sounds are the hum of the engine, the occasional crackle of radio static, and the rhythmic thump of tires over pavement. Through the narrow windows, he can see glimpses of the world he's leaving behind forever. Gas stations, strip malls, families loading groceries into minivans, life continuing as it always does. Then the road narrows. Trees give way to scrubland, the buildings disappear, and there it is. The Idaho Maximum Security Institution rises from the desert like a monument to despair, not tall but sprawling, beige concrete that seems designed to blend into the barren landscape, as if the architects wanted it to disappear, to be forgotten. But it's the fence that tells you what this place really is. Not one fence, 2. A double perimeter, both topped with coils of razor wire that glint in the harsh Idaho sun like steel serpents. Between them, an electronic detection system monitors every inch of ground. Above, armed guards patrol 24 hours a day from watchtowers that look down on everything with the indifferent gaze of surveillance cameras. This is where Idaho sends its monsters, the most dangerous, the most volatile, the men who society has decided cannot be allowed to live among others. As of 2025, Security Journal Americas ranked it as one of the 15 worst prisons in America. It shares that distinction with legendary hellholes like Attica in New York, San Quentin in California, and ADX Florence in Colorado, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The transport vehicle stops at the first gate. Guards approach, verify credentials, check underneath with mirrors on poles. The gate slides open with a grinding mechanical sound. They drive into the killing zone between the two fences. Behind them, the first gate closes. Ahead, the second gate opens. There's no going back now. Inside, the air is different, institutional. A mixture of disinfectant, concrete dust, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that no amount of cleaning can ever fully eliminate. The Reception and Diagnostic Unit, RDU, where new arrivals are evaluated, categorized, assigned, a process that typically takes 7 to 14 days. In that time, psychologists will assess him, medical staff will examine him, security experts will determine his threat level, but everyone already knows where Kohberger is going. J Block, the most restrictive housing unit in the entire facility, home to approximately 128 inmates, including all 8 of Idaho's male death row prisoners. Men like Chad Daybell, convicted of murdering his wife and 2 stepchildren, Thomas Eugene Creech, who may have killed up to 43 people, Gerald Pizzuto, a serial killer. These are Kohberger's new neighbors. But for now, he's taken to a holding cell. Single occupant, concrete walls painted industrial beige, a metal bed frame with a thin mattress, a steel toilet sink combination bolted to the wall, a fluorescent light behind reinforced glass that never fully turns off. The door closes. The lock engages with a sound like a rifle bolt, and Bryan Kohberger is alone. Later, when psychologists study the effects of long-term solitary confinement, they'll talk about the first night as crucial. It's when the reality sets in, when the mind first confronts what's ahead. For some inmates, this is when they break, screaming, banging on doors, begging to be let out. For others, the breakdown comes later, after weeks or months of accumulated isolation. Kohberger does neither. According to guards who observed him through the narrow window in his cell door, he sat on the edge of his bed for hours, not moving, not lying down, just sitting, staring at the opposite wall. What was he thinking in those hours? Was he replaying November 13th, 2022? The night he drove to Moscow, Idaho, entered that house on King Road, and methodically took 4 lives? Was he thinking about his life before? His childhood in Pennsylvania? His studies in criminology? The lectures he taught about the very things he would one day be imprisoned for? Or was he already doing what he'd spent years training himself to do, analyzing, categorizing, studying the situation from a detached, academic perspective? The criminologist examining his own incarceration as if it were a case study? The cameras captured everything but revealed nothing. His face remained expressionless, his body still. Around midnight, he finally lay down, but according to shift reports, his eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling. The light never went off. It never would. On July 29, 2025, 6 days after his sentencing, Bryan Kohberger was officially transferred to J Block Tier 2, cell number redacted for security reasons. Let me describe what that means. J Block is one of several housing units within IMC, but it's unlike the others. While some areas of the prison allow limited movement, group activities, even jobs, J Block is designed for one purpose: complete isolation. The cell measures approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, 80 square feet, about the size of a walk-in closet in a suburban home. This is where Bryan Kohberger will spend 23 hours of every single day for the rest of his life. The walls are concrete block, painted a color that bureaucratic documents probably call institutional beige, but that inmates simply call gray. Not because it is gray, but because everything here eventually becomes gray. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, even the light seems to drain color from the world. The bed is a metal frame bolted to the floor with a thin mattress that's replaced every few years. One pillow, 2 sheets, 1 blanket in winter, standard issue. Nothing extra. The toilet sink combination is stainless steel. The kind you can't break, can't dismantle, can't fashion into a weapon. The water is cold, always cold. There's a small metal desk attached to one wall, a stool also bolted down. This is where inmates eat meals, write letters, read books, where Kohberger, with his PhD-level education, now spends hours each day with nothing but his thoughts. One narrow window. Not to the outside world. That would be too much to hope for. Just to the corridor. Through it, guards can observe. Cameras mounted in the corners capture every movement from multiple angles. Privacy doesn't exist here. Even using the toilet happens under surveillance. The door is solid steel with a narrow slot at the bottom for food trays and a small window at eye level. Both can be closed from the outside. When guards want to, they can seal an inmate in complete sensory deprivation, no visual stimulation, no sound beyond what filters through concrete and steel. This is home. Forever. Every day in J Block follows the same pattern. Repetition is the architecture of madness. 30 a.m. The lights brighten, not suddenly. That would be merciful, shocking you awake, but gradually. By 6 a.m., they're at full institutional brightness. Kohberger typically wakes before this. Guards report that he often sits awake in the pre-dawn hours, just sitting on his bed, staring, waiting for a day that will be identical to yesterday and the day before and the day before that. 6:30 a.m. Breakfast. The slot at the bottom of the door slides open with a metallic screech. A tray is pushed through. The slot closes. Breakfast in J Block. Cold oatmeal, a piece of bread, a small carton of milk, a plastic spoon, nothing sharp, nothing that could be fashioned into a weapon. Kohberger has filed multiple complaints about his meals. "Not receiving all items of food on my tray," he wrote in one handwritten grievance dated July 31st, 2025, just 2 days after arriving in J Block. Whether items are actually missing or whether the portions simply don't match his expectations is unclear. But the complaint reveals something important. In a world where you control nothing, every small injustice becomes enormous. He has 30 minutes to eat. Then the slot opens again. The tray must be returned, every item accounted for, the plastic spoon, the empty containers, everything. Nothing can be kept. Nothing can be hoarded, nothing can be accumulated. This is called security protocol. 7 a.m., 11 a.m., morning cell time. 4 hours of nothing, no television. He can buy one from commissary, but only certain models are allowed. No computer, no internet. No phone calls. Those are scheduled separately and monitored. Just silence. Some inmates pace. Others do exercises. Push-ups, sit-ups, shadow boxing against the limitations of the tiny space. Some read, if they have books. Others simply lie on their beds and let the hours drain away like water through fingers. Kohberger, according to guards, mostly reads and writes. He's requested legal materials, psychology texts, books on criminology. The man who studied criminal behavior now lives as his own case study. He writes too. Letters, though to whom is unclear. Notes. He fills composition notebooks with dense handwriting. None of this is private. Anything an inmate writes can be read by staff, but he writes anyway, compulsively, as if documenting his own descent. What does he write about? His past, his victims, his regrets, if he has any? Or does he continue to do what he's always done, analyze, categorize, study the psychology of isolation as it slowly consumes him? 11:30 a.m. Lunch. The slot opens. Tray in. Slot closes. A sandwich. Maybe bologna, maybe peanut butter, some kind of vegetable, usually canned, a cookie if they're feeling generous, water to drink. This is notable. In a 2025 video that leaked online, causing a minor scandal and an internal investigation, viewers claimed to see Kohberger's cell. The video, taken through a narrow window by another inmate, showed conditions that some found surprisingly comfortable. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer commented on News Nation. That's bigger than most New York hotel rooms, but size is relative. A hotel room is somewhere you choose to be for a few nights. A cell is where you'll die. 12 p.m. 4 p.m. Afternoon. Cell time. More hours of nothing. This is when the mind begins to turn on itself, when thoughts that should be fleeting become obsessive, when memories loop endlessly because there's nothing new to replace them with. Psychologists who've studied long-term solitary confinement describe something called time distortion. Without external markers, without appointments, without seasons really changing inside concrete walls, without variety of any kind, the brain loses its ability to accurately measure time. Days blur into each other. Was it last week or last month that something happened? The mind can't tell. For Kohberger, every day is the same day, repeated infinitely. 4:30 p.m., dinner. Slot opens. Tray in, slot closes, typically the most substantial meal of the day, some kind of protein, chicken, mystery meat, occasionally fish, potatoes or rice, more vegetables, bread. The Idaho Department of Corrections offers vegan options. Whether Kohberger partakes is unknown, though his apartment before arrest reportedly contained vegan frozen pizzas. Hugs p.m., 8 p.m., evening cell time, the longest stretch, 3 hours of nothing as daylight fades into night. Some inmates read, others sleep. A few who've been granted tablets, purchased through commissary for around $100, watch movies or listen to music. The tablets contain no internet access, just pre-approved content. Does Kohberger have one? If so, what does he watch? Documentaries about crime? His own field of study? Or does he avoid anything that reminds him of who he was, what he studied, what he became? 8 p.m., 10 p.m., recreation hour, if scheduled. This is where it gets interesting. Inmates in long-term restrictive housing are entitled to 1 hour of outdoor recreation per day, 1 hour out of 24. But outdoor is relative. The recreation area in J Block is what officials call an enclosure and what inmates call a cage. Concrete floor, chain-link walls and ceiling, maybe 15 by 20 feet, covered in what multiple sources describe as trash, urine stains, and worse. In 2025, inmates at IMC organized hunger strikes specifically protesting these conditions. 90 men refused food for 6 days, calling the recreation cages a biohazard, and the HVAC system so dirty it was making them sick. The Idaho Statesman reported that some cages were covered in human feces. This is where Kohberger gets his hour of freedom. But even this isn't guaranteed. Recreation is scheduled, not automatic. If staff shortages occur, if there's a security incident elsewhere in the prison, if paperwork gets delayed, the rec hour gets canceled. And there's nothing you can do about it. When Kohberger does get outside, he's alone. J-block inmates don't recreate together. That's too dangerous. So he walks in circles inside a cage under the Idaho sky, breathing air that smells slightly less recycled, moving muscles that have been still for 23 hours. 1 hour, then back to the cell. 10 p.m., 5:30 a.m. overnight. The lights dim but never go dark. A persistent twilight that makes it hard to sleep deeply. The cameras continue recording, every shift, every breath. Guards make rounds every 30 minutes for high-profile inmates. A face appears at the window, checks that you're still alive, still there, still just a body in a box. This is sleep in J-block, shallow, interrupted, never fully restful. And when morning comes, when the lights brighten at 5:30 a.m., it all begins again, exactly the same, forever. In solitary confinement, human contact becomes the most valuable commodity in the world. A smile from a guard. A word from a medical tech. Anything that reminds you that you're still part of the human species. But official contact is minimal in J-block. Guards are trained to be professional, distant. Medical visits are brief and clinical. Interaction is a security risk, so inmates find other ways. The vents. Like most institutional buildings built in the late 1980s, IMSI has an HVAC system that connects every cell through air ducts. Originally designed just for climate control, these vents have become an underground communication system. Sound travels through them. Voices, whispers, screams. According to multiple reports, including statements from retired Detective Chris McDonough, who has first-hand knowledge of conditions inside J-block, Bryan Kohberger has been subjected to constant harassment through these vents from the moment he arrived. The inmates are tormenting him at night and almost all hours of the day, McDonough told media outlets, taunting him through the vents in his cell. What do they say? Some of it is predictable. The usual prison insults, threats, the kind of verbal abuse that happens in any confined male population. But some of it is specific, targeted, graphic. In August 2025, just days after his arrival, Kohberger filed multiple official complaints with the Idaho Department of Corrections. These documents, obtained by People magazine and other outlets, reveal a pattern of sustained psychological assault. July 30th, 2025, first complaint. In a handwritten resident concern form, Kohberger stated he was being subjected to minute-by-minute verbal threats harassment. He reported that other inmates were deliberately flooding their cells, clogging toilets to force water across the floor, and that he was not participating but was being blamed. He requested an immediate transfer to B-block, a quieter wing. August 4th, 2025, sexual threat complaint. In a follow-up communication, Kohberger's complaints became more specific and more disturbing. He claimed one inmate shouted at him, "I'll butt fuck you." Another allegedly called out, "The only ass we'll be eating is Kohberger's." A corrections officer's report confirmed hearing vulgar language being used, but could not identify which specific inmate was speaking. In J-block, with dozens of cells connected by vents, sound bounces and echoes. Pinpointing a source is nearly impossible. What the officer could confirm was this: it was constant. The Idaho Department of Corrections issued a statement. Incarcerated individuals commonly communicate with each other in prison. Bryan Kohberger is housed alone in a cell, and Idaho security staff maintain a safe and orderly environment for all individuals in our custody. Translation: yes, inmates talk to each other through vents. Yes, some of what they say is unpleasant. No, We're not going to do anything about it. Dr. Gary Brucato, a forensic psychologist, offered insight into why Kohberger might be particularly vulnerable to this kind of harassment. Offenders like Kohberger typically seek social acceptance and command of their surroundings, he told CBS News. When Kohberger accepted the plea deal, avoiding the death penalty, Brucato suggests he likely felt he'd regained some control over his situation. He'd made a choice. He'd negotiated. Instead, Brucato explained, he is in a situation where they are ridiculing him, mocking him. He's being robbed of that infamy, that attention, and that control. In other words, Kohberger thought he was avoiding the worst. Instead, he walked into a different kind of torture, one without end. On August 12, 2025, prison officials held a hearing to address Kohberger's requests for protective custody, a different housing arrangement that might shield him from the worst of the harassment. These hearings are not public. No media, no recording, just the inmate, prison staff, and a deputy warden who makes the final decision. What was said in that room isn't fully public. But according to the Idaho Statesman and other outlets during the proceedings, Kohberger himself admitted something revealing. He acknowledged that he would likely become less of a target as outside interest in his case faded. Think about that statement. Kohberger understands that his notoriety is what makes him a target. He's smart enough, analytical enough, to recognize that time will eventually erode public interest. In 5 years, in 10 years, he'll be just another lifer. Another body in a cell. The death of 4 college students will fade from headlines, displaced by newer tragedies. And when that happens, maybe the other inmates will leave him alone. Maybe. But the deputy warden's decision was final. Kohberger would remain in J Block Tier 2, in long-term restrictive housing. No transfer, no special protection, just the same cell, the same routine, the same voices through the vents. Welcome to justice, American style. To understand what Kohberger faces, you need to know who surrounds him in J Block. These aren't ordinary criminals. These are men who've committed acts so monstrous that society has either sentenced them to death or locked them away forever. Chad Daybell. Currently on death row, awaiting execution for the murders of his first wife, Tammy Daybell, and 2 children of his second wife, Lori Vallow, 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow, and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan. The case captivated the nation with its bizarre religious motivations and the months-long search for the missing children whose bodies were eventually found buried on Daybell's property. He's 55 years old. He will likely die here, whether by execution or old age. Thomas Eugene Creech. Idaho's longest-serving death row inmate, convicted of 5 murders across 3 states, but suspected in up to 43. At 73 years old, he's been locked up since the 1970s, half a century behind bars. In February 2024, the state attempted to execute him by lethal injection. The execution was aborted when medical staff couldn't find a vein to insert the IV line. He's still waiting, still alive, still in J Block. Gerald Pizzuto. Another serial killer convicted of murdering 4 people, sentenced to death, still waiting. These are the men who share walls with Bryan Kohberger, men who've spent years, decades in these cages. Men who know every trick, every psychological game, every way to make life in here more unbearable for someone new. And they're not the only ones. J Block houses approximately 128 inmates total. Some are awaiting trial for capital crimes. Others are in protective custody because they'd be killed in general population, gang dropouts, informants, child predators. In prison hierarchy, there's a code. An unwritten law that even murderers follow. You don't harm children, you don't hurt women. Bryan Kohberger killed 4 young people, including 2 women, in their own home. By prison standards, he's at the bottom of the hierarchy, lower than gang members, lower than thieves. In the moral economy of incarceration, he's worthless, and everyone in J Block knows it. Let's talk about what's really happening to Bryan Kohberger. Not the surface-level existence, the meals, the schedule, the concrete walls. Let's talk about what's happening inside his skull, because that's where the real punishment occurs. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist who spent decades studying solitary confinement, documented a specific syndrome he called SHU syndrome. SHU being prison slang for special housing unit, another term for solitary. The symptoms are consistent across populations, across cultures, across time. When you take a human being and isolate them for extended periods, their brain begins to malfunction in predictable ways. Stage 1. Hyperresponsivity to external stimuli. In the first days and weeks, isolated inmates become hypersensitive to even minor stimuli. The sound of a door closing echoes like a gunshot. A guard's footsteps become thunder. The fluorescent lights, which prisoners in general population barely notice, become intensely irritating. This is the brain trying to cope with sensory deprivation by amplifying whatever input it receives. It's not madness yet. It's adaptation. Kohberger would have experienced this in his first weeks. Every small noise through the vents magnified. Every flicker of the overhead light noticed. Every sensation in his body, heartbeat, breathing, the texture of fabric against skin, becoming almost overwhelming. Stage 2. Perceptual distortions. After weeks or months, the brain begins creating its own stimuli. Hallucinations, though that word carries more weight than the reality. We're not talking about full-blown psychotic breaks, though those happen too. We're talking about shadows that seem to move when nothing is there. Sounds that might be voices or might be the air conditioning. A face in the corner of your vision that disappears when you look directly. Multiple inmates in long-term solitary have reported feeling like someone is standing behind them, even though they know logically they're alone in a cell. The brain, desperate for human contact, manufactures it. Is Kohberger experiencing this yet? It's only been a few months, but the process has begun. Stage 3. Panic attacks and difficulty with concentration. The third stage hits differently. Instead of the mind racing, it starts to slow down. Simple tasks become difficult. Reading a book, something Kohberger did professionally as a PhD student, becomes a struggle. You read the same paragraph 5 times and can't remember what it said. Panic attacks become common. Sudden, overwhelming anxiety with no trigger. Your heart races. You can't breathe. The walls seem to be closing in even though they haven't moved. This usually emerges after 3 to 6 months, right about where Kohberger is now. Stage 4. Intrusive thoughts and emotional withdrawal. This is where it gets dangerous. Inmates begin experiencing obsessive, intrusive thoughts, the same memories playing on repeat, the same regrets circling endlessly, the same fears growing larger and larger until they consume everything. And here's the paradox. As these internal experiences become more intense, external emotional responses flatten. Guards describe long-term solitary inmates as becoming robot-like, flat effect, monotone speech, no visible reaction to news, whether good or bad. It's not that they don't feel anything, it's that they feel too much, and the only way to survive is to shut down emotionally. Is this what guards see when they look at Kohberger? That expressionless face that's been analyzed 1,000,000 times in courtroom footage? Is it coldness, or is it survival mode? Stage 5. Cognitive deterioration. In extreme cases, years of solitary confinement, inmates begin to lose cognitive function, memory problems, difficulty with logical reasoning, in some cases, permanent brain damage. A 2013 study using MRI scans found that prisoners in long-term solitary confinement showed reduced brain volume in areas associated with emotional regulation and social interaction. The damage was, in some cases, irreversible. Kohberger isn't there yet, but he has decades ahead of him, decades in that cell, decades of nothing. What will be left of his mind in 10 years, in 20, in 50? Here's the cruel irony that nobody talks about. Bryan Kohberger knows all of this. He didn't just take a few psychology classes. He was pursuing a PhD in criminology. His research focused on criminal behavior, the psychology of violence, and, relevant here, the effects of incarceration on offenders. He's read the studies. He knows about Grassian's work. He understands what solitary confinement does to the human brain. And now, he's living it. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being enough of an expert to recognize your own psychological deterioration as it happens, to be able to identify each symptom, to understand exactly what's occurring in your brain at the neurological level, but being completely powerless to stop it. It's like a doctor with terminal cancer. They know what's happening. They can see the progression. They understand the prognosis. But knowledge doesn't prevent death. Kohberger is watching himself break, documenting it perhaps in those notebooks he fills with dense handwriting, observing his own case study with the same clinical detachment he once applied to others. But here's what he couldn't have known from the books, from the research, from all his academic studies, what it actually feels like. The books talk about anxiety and panic attacks, but they can't convey what it feels like when your own heartbeat becomes a source of terror. When you lie awake at 3 a.m. convinced you're having a heart attack even though you're 30 years old and healthy. The research papers describe auditory hallucinations, but they can't capture the experience of hearing your own name whispered when nobody is there, or the sound of footsteps approaching your cell when you know the guard is at the other end of the corridor. The studies mention time distortion, but they can't explain what it's like when you've been sitting on your bunk for what feels like hours, and you look up to see that only 12 minutes have passed, or when an entire day vanishes and you can't remember a single thing you did. This is the education Bryan Kohberger is receiving now, not from books, from experience, and it's an education that will last the rest of his life. In August 2025, News Nation interviewed forensic psychologist Dr. Gary Bricotto and several corrections experts about Kohberger's situation. The question they kept returning to was simple. Is this worse than death? Kohberger accepted a plea deal specifically to avoid execution. He chose life in prison over death. At the time, it must have seemed like a victory, a way to beat the system. But now, months into his sentence, some experts are questioning whether he made the right choice. An execution in Idaho, when it finally happens, takes seconds, minutes at most. The method is debated, the drugs are controversial, but the timeline is brief. One moment you're alive. The next, you're not. But this is death in slow motion. 23 hours a day in a concrete box for the next 40, 50, maybe 60 years if he lives that long. Over 20,000 days of waking up to the same walls, the same routine, the same nothingness. That's over 480,000 hours. Over 28 million minutes. Put another way, if an execution takes 10 minutes, that's 2.8 million executions stretched out over a lifetime. Some prisoners call it living death, one former corrections officer told researchers. The body keeps going, but everything that makes you a person, your thoughts, your feelings, your sense of self, it all slowly erodes until you're just existing. Is that justice? Or is it cruelty disguised as mercy? The answer probably depends on who you ask. The families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin might say it's exactly what he deserves. that every day of suffering is a tiny payment toward an impossible debt. Others, prison reformers, human rights advocates, even some religious leaders, argue that this kind of extreme isolation constitutes torture under international law. That while Kohberger may deserve punishment, no human being deserves to be psychologically destroyed. And Bryan Kohberger himself? What does he think? We'll never know. Inmates in his position rarely give interviews. And even if he did speak publicly, could we trust what he said? Would he admit regret, despair, or would he maintain that analytical distance, treating his own suffering as just another data point in the study of human psychology? Let's examine IMSI's reputation. In 2024, Security Journal Americas named it one of the 15 worst prisons in America, alongside notorious facilities like Attica and San Quentin. Why? Physical conditions. In 2024, 90 inmates staged a hunger strike protesting conditions they called biohazard. The recreation cages were reportedly covered in feces and urine. The HVAC system was described as filthy, making inmates sick. Understaffing. Idaho's corrections system faces chronic staffing shortages. Fewer guards means less supervision, more violence, delayed medical care, canceled recreation hours, and interrupted basic services. Violence. While J-Block isolates inmates individually, violence still occurs through psychological warfare via ventilation systems, creating an atmosphere of perpetual tension. This is where Idaho sends its worst. And this is where Bryan Kohberger will spend every remaining day of his life. 90 minutes. That's how long we've spent inside Bryan Kohberger's world. Inside his cell, his mind, his daily existence. We've walked through his routine, the same meals at the same times, the 23 hours of confinement, the single hour of recreation in a cage. We've heard the voices through the vents, the taunts, the threats. We've examined the psychology of isolation and what it does to the human brain. We've looked at the man who once studied killers and now lives as one of them. But what have we learned? Perhaps this, that punishment is more complex than we imagine. That justice isn't always clean or simple or satisfying. 4 young people died in November 2022. 4 futures erased. 4 families destroyed. Nothing, no sentence, no punishment, no amount of suffering can balance that equation. But does that mean anything is acceptable? Does it mean we should look away from what happens inside these walls? Bryan Kohberger chose his path. He made decisions that night in Moscow, Idaho, that led him here. Nobody forced him to drive to that house. Nobody made him climb those stairs. Nobody guided his hand. He owns that. But we own this. The society that builds these prisons, the system that buries people alive in concrete boxes for decades. The collective decision to call this justice. Is it? Is watching a human mind slowly deteriorate, even a mind that committed terrible acts, something we should be comfortable with? In the end, this isn't really about Bryan Kohberger. It's about Kaylee Goncalves, who will never graduate college, Madison Mogan, who will never pursue her dreams, Zana Kernodle, who will never see another birthday, Ethan Chapin, who will never grow old. Their families carry grief that most of us can't imagine. And when they look at Bryan Kohberger's sentence, life in solitary confinement, they see something different than prison reformers see. Christy Goncalves, Kaylee's mother, made it clear at sentencing, "May you continue to live your life in misery." Not death. Misery. Perhaps that's what justice actually is. Not balance, not restoration, just consequences, actions and their aftermath, cause and effect stretched across decades. This documentary will end. You'll close this tab, move on with your day, think about other things. But for Bryan Kohberger, There is no moving on. There is only repetition. Tomorrow morning at 5:30 a.m., the lights will brighten. At 6:30, breakfast will slide through the slot. The hours will pass with the same crushing sameness. The voices through the vents will continue. In 10 years, he'll still be there. In 20 years, in 50 years, if he lives that long. The man who wanted to understand killers will have a lifetime to understand himself. The student of criminal psychology will have decades to study his own mind as it slowly breaks. And maybe that's the final irony. Bryan Kohberger dedicated his life to understanding the criminal mind. Now he has nothing but time to explore his own. Forever. We started this journey asking a question. Is life in solitary confinement worse than death? After 90 minutes inside Bryan Kohberger's world, perhaps you have your own answer now. Perhaps you believe this is exactly what he deserves. That every day of suffering is justice for the lives he took. Or perhaps you believe that no matter what someone has done, this level of isolation, this systematic destruction of the human mind, crosses a line we shouldn't cross as a society. There's no easy answer, no comfortable conclusion. Just a man in a cell, breathing, existing, counting the minutes of a life that has become its own prison, and the knowledge that this is what justice looks like in America. What do you think? Is this justice or cruelty? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into the hidden realities of the criminal justice system, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more stories that need to be told.